Good day and welcome to Big Biz with myself, your host, Billy Bukako. Thank you for joining us as we embark on a maiden voyage towards demystifying the SME sector in our country. In this podcast, we'll be having important conversations with various players within our ecosystem. This is the aim of creating a meeting spot where we learn, impart knowledge and influence. This is the first episode of our 4-part pilot series. Please do interact with us on our social media platforms. Give us as much feedback as possible so that we can come back with a full series. Our handles are on the screen. We thought of what best conversation to have as we mark the beginning of Global Entrepreneurship Week. We thought of talking about enterprise supplier development. BBBE was legislated as a corrective means, an effort to reverse, if you please, the injustices of the past, where minorities held and controlled the majority of the economy. The Act seeks to motivate corporate and public participation in the conscious contribution towards creation of big corporates and industrialists from the SME base in the country. It has not been all roses. One of the 5 elements used to measure transformation under the BBBE Act is the enterprise supplier development, which encompasses preferential procurement, which promotes the procurement of goods and services from previously disadvantaged individuals, supplier diversity, enterprise development, where companies create a resilient supply chain through empowerment and onboarding of new black suppliers. In 2015, an amendment was made to the BBBE codes and supplier development was added, which seeks to empower existing suppliers within the supply chain of corporates. The Sanlam Gauge report is one of the most important documents in the space that we reflect on. The 2023 version of the Sanlam Gauge report surveyed 14,000 companies in an effort to gauge transformation in various sectors of the economy. The report paints a grim picture where ESD scoring has either decreased or stagnated across most sectors of the economy. To unpack this seemingly complex animal, we have in conversation my guest today, Mr. Litha Kutta. Welcome, Kutta.
Thanks.
How are you today?
I'm doing all right, and you?
I am good. Thank you so much for joining us here at Big Biz. I would perhaps like for you to introduce yourself to our guests and tell us more about who you are and what you do.
Okay. Firstly, thanks for inviting me to be part of your show. My name is Litha Kutta. Originally, I'm from Cape Town, and I did my studies at Cape Technikon and Peninsula Technikon, which currently they refer as CPUT. I did political science and also did business studies. Then I've also done a financial degree at Stellenbosch and finished my master's last year. Currently I'm doing my PhD in entrepreneurship.
Oh.
In terms of my career, I've headed up ESD for the Western Cape province. So I was responsible for entrepreneurship development in the Western Cape, and then moved from government and then also did some work for DTI, looking after grants and incentive for the Western Cape. And I then made the move to the private sector, where I worked for Woolworths, heading up their ESD program. Then I also worked for Edcon in transformation. I moved to Telkom to be the head of ESD, and recently I was a director at Tiger Brands, responsible for their ESD. My current job is that I'm at Land Bank now and looking after partnerships with the private sector to do ESD in agriculture.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see you also co-chairperson for the ESD community of practice.
Yes, yeah. That's an interesting one, because the whole journey around creating a sector body started pretty much about 10, 12 years ago, where we started to set up an organization called EDCSA, which is Enterprise Development Council of South Africa, where we were trying to get practitioners to come together, because the sector was forming because of the regulation, and it was maturing, but we were not a united, a group of people. Like if you look at SEICA for accountants, we don't have that. So it's been a 10-year journey where we've been working with the Department of Small Business Development, to set up a sector body which is currently called ESD, Committee of Practice, which I'm a co-chair representing the private sector. So we also have got another co-chair who actually does the public sector, but the intention is to develop the practitioners and make sure that we also come up with standards for the sector and training programs to elevate the skill set.
Okay, we'll get into that a little bit later.
Okay.
But I just wanted to check with you, where do you think we are in terms of ESD as a country?
Currently, we're a bit stagnating, and remember that ESD is a redress program. What that means is that there were issues that happened before 1994, where black people were deliberately excluded from the economy, and mainly using, your Group Areas Act to make sure that black people couldn't industrialize, and there were other regulations that we passed where black people couldn't participate in agriculture, there was land dispossession. And when we started in 1994, there were acts that came through, a Small Business Act that came in and, that tried to sort of galvanize the country to start supporting small businesses, which was followed by the BE Act, which came in 2003. But there's a bit of fatigue now, and also it aligns to what is happening politically. Remember that because this is an act of parliament, it does integrate to the political system of the country. It is being done, but you can see the intensity is not as it was some few years ago. So it needs some bit of vigor to be sort of brought back. So you see a lot of, suppliers still struggling to get into, black suppliers struggling to get into supply chains. Some of the companies who used to have ESD funds no longer have that. There are some companies that have actually even reduced the size of their ESD budgets, which if you read the over and above the Sanlam Gauge, there is a report that was done by the BE Commissioner, which actually shows that the spend of ESD is actually reduced, meaning that companies are actually spending less than they were doing. So it's, at the end of the day, if you reduce spend, it doesn't matter what you say. It actually just means that there's less resources being put into the program. So we've got a bit of that challenge currently.
Would you say that is maybe a consequence of, the current economic climate? Or is it that maybe, there is no enforcement in terms of, the amount that corporates need to spend, in ESD?
Yeah, so the first thing is that BE is not a punitive act. It's not like the tax acts that if you don't do it, you can actually be charged. It's a voluntary. People do it because they want to do it. And the first thing is that it depends on leadership. So you might get a CEO who's excited about BE, then you'll see an elevation of execution. But you can also see a CEO who's very conservative, less interested. You'll also see how the execution would actually just sort of fizzle off. But some of those pressures those CEOs are having links to what you're saying because of economic conditions. I've once spoke to a CEO who said, Litha, I would want to buy a generator than invest in ESD because I need to keep my factories running because of energy insecurity. So issues around, energy insecurity are affecting because budgets are being shifted. Issues of just the economy not doing well, it means there's less money because ESD spend is linked to NPAT. NPAT is linked to your top line revenue. So if your company's revenue is going down, the spend is going to go down. But also the political climate. We've seen, for example, PRASA trying to issue tenders to involve contractors and being taken to court. So there's also that element where there's a pushback around, the whole BE as a construct. So all those things, they do affect how we actually, progress. So every time we make a step, we go back a little bit. Step backs.
Yeah, I think usually, more often than not, when we talk about ESD, we talk about the Pentagon formation, right? The 5 different, role players that, anchor the system that is ESD. We talk about the corporate, we talk about the entrepreneur, we talk about the practitioner, we talk about the service provider or fund manager, we talk about the state as well. So all those 5 role players have an integral role in ensuring that ESD moves forward. Let's talk about each of those roles and what each of those 5 role players bring to the mix. That makes sure that this thing goes. And maybe let's touch on some of the things that we are not doing so well, and maybe some of those that contribute.
Yeah. So everything starts with the state, and the reason why that is the case is because they set the scene in terms of transformation and inclusion generally. So just to do an example, in the 60s, President Nixon is the one who signed the whole issue around your diversity, council in USA. So that's why today they've got supplier diversity, is because they made it law, right? And as a result of that, companies had to do inclusion projects in their supply chain. But that came because of the civil rights movement that happened with obviously Martin Luther King dying and Malcolm X passing on, and there was a heightened political climate where black people were complaining that they were not participating in the economy. Then Nixon decided then that supply inclusion is something that they're going to do, and that led to supply diversity as a program. Okay. And you can see how it started from a civil rights. Yeah. When you look at South Africa, exactly the same. It's the civil rights that we're fighting the apartheid, which then led to the and us having a law in the form of a BEE. And the role of the state is to be able to set the agenda. And obviously that process needs to be done in a consultative manner to make sure that all the different stakeholders and constituencies are part of that process. And because we are a developmental state by virtue of the exclusion that happened pre-1994, then you've got a government that must intervene, because unfortunately in South Africa things don't happen by themselves. So you have a government that set up the BE Act and also had to be a player. That's why NEF was set up, to make sure that there's funding to fund black people who wanted to participate. So the role of the state was to make sure the law is there and the support instruments. And because there was, a resistance, that's how the commissioner was set up, to make sure that they police. In terms of their intensity of policing, that's
another conversation.
Yeah, it's a conversation for a different day, but there's really been a try from themselves, to call out companies that were using BEE for ulterior motives. There's been enough of that's been done. We've seen how the triple PFA was abused by some listed companies where the 30% set aside for black companies, that there were a lot of scrupulous deals being done there, and the big commissioner was involved in picking up some of those things. So there's been a bit of compliance by the state. There is an issue that people want the government to do more, right? But the resources are very challenging. If you look at the climate, the taxation collection affects the ability to be able to have more money to be put into these programs.
I just want to quickly, pick up on something that you mentioned there around, the state being also responsible to ensure that there's compliance. Do you think that ESD should be enforceable? Should it be legislated that it is an activity that needs to happen and within a certain framework, right? Because what I'm gathering from our conversation is that it is a choice for corporates to do it. Should it be enforceable?
So if we take it back pre-1994, there were apartheid laws. They were not enforced. But people did it because it favored them. That's why there was no compliance. There were a bit of compliance, that was done by government to make sure that companies are, they toed the line. But it was, government who precluded black entrepreneurs from participating in the economy, and at the same time, you had companies being run by our fellow white, citizens, and it favored them, so they didn't mind. They really didn't mind. There are few that did, that actually took, offense to the issues. Some left the country because they didn't like what was happening. There are some companies that left the country because they didn't like it, but some did not. They actually did it because it favored, their own population. So there was no need to chase after them. But now, when it comes to transformation, currently you're asking the same people to actually drive inclusion programs. And you will find it's always those progressive people that will do it, right? So as a compliance, it has to be, compliance is done when people do not voluntarily comply and do it by themselves. So when people say it's a tick box, of course it is, because if it's not, people are not going to do it because they can opt out of it. Right?
Yeah, I want to touch into that tick box when we talk about the corporate.
Yeah.
I also wanted to check in terms of, as a developing country, where are we in terms of our transformation and inclusion as South Africa, if we, compare to, the rest of our peers who are also developing?
So the issue of inclusion, as I said, that America started in the 60s. Between 2000 and now, we started seeing Britain coming out with supply diversity program. Canada came up with one. Recently, after 2010, even China came up with one, right? So there is a move to look at, your minorities in other countries, because we're the only country where economically the majority are minority economically.
Yes.
Rest of the country, the majority in population dominate the economy, right? So there is that drive in other countries to actually start looking at issues of inclusion. In fact, there's a bigger drive to not even to drive inclusion, but to drive social and economic justice. To make sure that those that were excluded or disenfranchised or, are able to be given the opportunity to actually participate. So as a country, our model works in terms of the framework, right? Other countries are not necessarily regulating it to the level to which we, because of the resistance, right? The only difference is that we blow hot and cold into it. So we do it well in some instances, then for funny reason, we regress. And all of these things talks to issues of leadership, both in public and the private sector. You find one minister who's going to drive this and another minister who's not as intense as the previous ones. So different administrations have been dealing with BE in different ways. But in other countries, because of the Me Too movement, there's a lot of drive to look at issues around, discrimination and the exclusion of people. So it's picking up globally. In South Africa, it's sort of at a medium.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think let's get into the conversation around the role of the corporate, the private sector. What is it that they bring to the table when we talk issues of ESD?
It's massive. It's absolutely massive. Remember, the biggest issue about private sector is that they keep the economy going. There's no question about that in terms of the activities. And when you look at the spend of private sector collectively, remember government spends a factor of the tax they collect from the private sector. So you can imagine that the procurement in private sector is far more bigger than the state. So in terms of getting entrepreneurship going, industrialization going, export development going, the private sector is massive. And also there's private sector both in urban and also in rural areas. So you're talking about a constituency that without their participation, there's never going to be enterprise and supply development. And entrepreneurs, I know that there is a piece that wants to do business with government, all right? But you find most big companies started in government pre-1994, grew themselves such that they were able to go to the private sector. Then out of the private sector, local, then they go to global private sector. So we've got global companies here that have moved into that direction, because government, the state should give you normally your first round opportunity, then the private sector, because they buy from companies that know what they're doing because they make money out of that procurement. That's why the level of startups is very tricky from a private sector to, they normally would want, companies that have proven capabilities to be able to deliver. So their participation is absolutely critical. And those companies that have actually embraced ESD, you can see the effect that they have is massive in terms of the job creation that they create, creating of black industrialists that are there. So private sector is a constituency that we must always make sure that they actually participate and they continue to participate. But again, as I said, they are also hit by their own issues around the markets that are not doing well, that affects their ability to invest in ESDs and programs or not. And sometimes when they are struggling commercially, they tend to do less of ESD. So those are realities. But they need to be pushed that when they do well commercially, it should also translate into more investment in ESD and more black suppliers being onboarded into their supply chain.
Yeah. So when you talk about corporates, right, especially with ESD practitioners, there is some sort of a feeling, right, that certain companies would do this as a tick box exercise. So they would get a Big Biz Inc. on board and give them just, catering here, printing stationery here and there, which sometimes, feels like a tick box exercise just for them to get the points. How do we measure the real impact of the work that corporate does in this space, right?
Yeah. So the issue is that the whole issue around non-core, that used to happen before 2010. It's happening now. There's still a bit of that, but companies have started to realize that why spend 100 million to people who are going to supply you paper? Makes no sense, because there's a business unit within the corporate that makes 100 million, that works hard to generate 100 million. So there's been a lot of push to integrate into the core, right? What just needs to happen is the intensity of doing that, so that we've got entrepreneurs that get exposed to core business, and also they get to be expanded to grow bigger. Because unfortunately, when it comes to core, then you're talking about very few numbers of people that can supply into the core business of corporates. But the challenge is that we haven't seen the ones who crack it growing into 200, 300 million businesses, right? So it's the intensity and also staying the course, So some companies crack to get to supply core, goods or services, but they never get to be expanded, or there is fatigue in the private sector where they reach a point where they plateau in terms of their growth. But the whole issue around business development support is also very, very fundamental. So if you look at the programs, most of them, even if you go to government services, it's generic, right? But I know there are some organizations that are set up through incubators that are sector specific. We don't have enough of those. As a result of that, it affects the ability of the private sector to actually source core products from local, because there's no capabilities that are there. And to build that capability takes a long time. So for me, it's something that needs to be done. We need to relook at our programs as a country. When I say country, I mean government, in collaboration with the private sector. For example, there was NEMEC in the old days. We used to support entrepreneurs that were in manufacturing. That NEMEC was critical in your reindustrialization. But when CETA was merged, they tossed it aside. And now we are struggling to have manufacturing-based companies. It's because we don't have organizations
that
look after that constituency. I know, CSR is trying to do some projects in manufacturing with their cleaner production. We've got issues around failure of small business, and you've got, productivity exchange has got a turnaround program that doesn't get enough money to reverse business failure. So we need to go back and relook at our instruments, so that we can create, support services like for CMT, If you set up CMT, which is cut, make and trim, critical for your clothing industry, then you can have all the big retail fashion retailers buying in because
finding a spot where they can always
because there's support structure that is available. Currently, those are the issues that we are struggling with, that we don't have support structures for core that will churn out engineers, CMTs, even agriculture. I'm seeing now that there is a movement to start having incubators in agriculture, which is excellent for agriculture. So we need more of those sectorial based. That then helps the private sector from a core.
Because they can always go to just a one stop where
Exactly.
and also for capacity issues. For instance, in the setup of an incubator, you will have probably more than one company doing the same thing, right? So if you're a corporate and you need economies of scale, that sort of setup becomes a good feeder.
Correct.
Into that.
And I can even do examples of. One example, 2 years ago, I did a presentation around egg powder. People were like, what are you even talking about? I said,
what were you talking about?
At Tiger, we buy eggs when I was working there to make mayonnaise. But when there's avian flu, you use powder. Guess what we have now? We've got avian flu.
An outbreak.
But you're not just going to wake up and create an egg powder. If there was an incubator that specializes in producing, milled product, because it's a milling, you convert it into powder basically. You can start having onion powder, garlic powder. And now entrepreneurs have got entry, and the corporate is looking for garlic powder, knows where to go. So do you see where the capacity to support, where you find them is critical to the. Because now as a corporate, I needed to sit and say, how do I develop this? So that collaboration between public and private sector becomes
so important,
super
because
critical.
Also as a corporate, your core is to ensure that your operations run smoothly.
Correct.
This becomes an added extra. And to have a meeting spot where all these other people that are supposed to, bring some value, converge is important. Okay. So what are some of the issues that, or maybe challenges that we experience when we look into the actual implementation? So I'm talking about the service providers and the practitioners.
I'll split the answer into two. I'll first talk about the service provider and implementation, then go to fund management. So when you look at the service providers or ESD implementation, most of them provide generic offering. That's why the difference between the two is very marginal. And yet we've got issues in the private sector that we've mentioned that we want to supply to core, right? So we need to look at how do we tilt from generic, because generic talks mainly works in non-core. Once you start going into specialized, ESD implementation, and capacity building, then you start talking to core areas that we need to look at. So unfortunately, because there are no standards in the industry, anyone can be a service provider, right? And most of the programs that are there, you'll find that they are very much programs where it's mass-based. They'll train 300 people, 400. When you go back 3-4 years later, nothing much has happened to those people, but the money has been spent. So, and also the drive by e-service providers it's got a commercial interest. So the question is, the service provider wants to provide the best solution for the entrepreneur to succeed, or do you want to make money? Unfortunately, we've even reached a point where we can judge their effectiveness based on the success of the entrepreneur, which is creating a problem, because without that success of the entrepreneur, and some of them complaining, the service providers in ESD seems to getting more richer than the entrepreneurs they're supposed to be supporting. That goes back to the issue which we'll cover around the ESD practitioner, because that's the person who should be able to manage that. So we need more service providers, but that are more specialized. So if I do agriculture, We need someone who can do an ESD in agriculture and not take a generic route in agriculture, right? If I say I want to support fruit, farmers, you've got to be able to get a service provider that understands how to design a fruit program, a growing program, and how it gets funded, what are the capabilities that needs to be supported from the entrepreneur. And so it goes into other industries, whether it's engineering, and in other, very strategic and very specialized area. So we lack specialization in the country. There's more generic. And then when it comes to fund managers, this whole came because the codes allowed for companies to give money to a fund manager and claim PE points, whether the money is spent or not, right? And obviously people that are in private equity started seeing this opportunity and started setting themselves as this fund management. And there's been a lot of them growing, sitting with a lot of money, but the money does not reach the intended beneficiary. So there's been that complaint a lot around, because it's all about fund management fees that the fund managers are making. And even if you speak to some of the leaders, they will tell you how much funds they are managing. So that is more important that I'm managing a 2 billion ESD fund than how many SMEs I've supported that are now 100, 200 million revenue. So they're driven by different, matrix, So there are fund managers that are excellent in what they do. They really, do the right thing. They find entrepreneurs, they are specialized in their areas of funding. So there's a tag of war between how do you find those as opposed to the ones that break themselves for...
That are just mushrooming all over the place.
Yes, and everyone wants the management fee that you get, because you get paid that management fee whether you fund it or not. So there is no incentive to go and do deal origination and making sure that you pipeline, you fund and you collect the money. So those are the issues that you find in fund management. But it's necessary to have those fund management as specialized instruments because of the market failure in the financial services, right? So we still need them. We need to make sure that we get them not to take the private equity mentality or, into an ESD, because the mandates in private equity or venture capital is not the same as in ESD, because that is a development finance. So you always have to balance your developmental mandate and also the funding that you provide.
That is actually quite interesting. I think we want to look into what the role of the beneficiaries, the entrepreneurs. There is, more often than not, if you speak to entrepreneurs, there's a lot of finger pointing, in terms of what the state is not doing, what company A is not doing. But what about what they bring to the mix?
I think the issue for me is that we haven't been in a situation where someone calls out entrepreneurs. I've been exposed to programs where, remember when an opportunity presents itself for an entrepreneur, I could have been in a tug of war inside the corporate for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months to unlock the opportunity. And when they cave in and say, okay, we give you the opportunity, show us what you can do. The biggest challenge is not getting the opportunity. The biggest challenge is, do you give it to the right entrepreneur? It's the most very stressful, because if you give it to a wrong entrepreneur, they don't just cave that opportunity, they cave the whole programs. Because people are always going to point to say, but we gave you, and that those entrepreneurs of yours, they failed, they don't deliver, they don't do A, B, C, D. So there are many black entrepreneurs that are excellent at what they do. Unfortunately, there's just few of them. And there are more that are, that are not. That is why selection becomes super critical to identify. Because if you get a wrong entrepreneur, and in fact, this is not a black or white issue. If you get a wrong entrepreneur, you're going to be in trouble from the supply chain, from the procurement. And procurement are just going to be very annoyed if they get the wrong person, put that person out, and in some instances, if it's an ESD program, they'll take those volumes and give it, or that opportunity to give it to a supplier they already knew could develop, but they were taking a leap of faith. So the role of entrepreneurs seriously taking these opportunities is super critical.
Yeah.
You know, but there's a lot of them that they have the gift of the gab to talk the language, but they don't.
When it comes to
actions, they can't. I've experienced personally some, and there are some who are so good, just that they might not have the networks to get into the system. They are not gifted to speak well, to wow people, you know. So we need to be able to create, you know, those opportunities that people are exposed to opportunities. But we need to make sure that we create checks and balances. One of the things, for example, they do in USA, when you're ESD, I'll talk in South African language, if you're an ESD beneficiary, you get a certificate, right? They call it, if you are part of your supply diversity program, you get a certificate as a beneficiary. If you mess up, it gets told, there's a database where this one, if you mess up at Ford, if you go tomorrow to, you know, to let's say another company, they will pick it up because it gets updated.
It's like you're sitting in a database of offenders.
Yes, no, it's for all of them. If Billy comes, I'll just put your details.
Yeah.
And I can see whether you were good there or not.
Or not, yes.
So people mess up in one corporate and they jump to another because they sort of got, you know, when you get how to get things. There are people who knows exactly what to do to get into
we
this.
See it a lot.
And they do. So there's a lot of that. But there's amazing black entrepreneurs that really have done well. It's just that we're not talking enough about those. But I'm always also like to highlight that there are those who are actually putting a bad name. And it messes up the practitioner that look for opportunity. It messes up the procurement teams that have given the entrepreneur the opportunity.
We're hoping to use this space, you know, to elevate those conversations and shine the light on the people that are doing, you know, good work. Just as we were talking about the entrepreneurs that, you know, let's call them bad potatoes, right? In incubation, we've got a term, we call it forced graduations. So we exit you in the program.
Yeah.
And I
Makes
think,
sense. Makes sense.
Yeah, because there's a lot that's riding on, you know, the resources that you're deploying towards this person who is not really, you know.
The worst thing for us in ESD is that it's got reputational risk.
Yes.
Right. And it can collapse the program. Because remember, procurement has to buy into it.
It has to be resilient.
Yes. So it's important to get the right entrepreneurs.
I think we can't have this conversation and not touch on the issue of localization, right? The IPAP talks about 23 sectors that have been opened up for, you know, localization. The DSBD has also focused on about 12 areas and about 1,000 products that are earmarked for localization. How are we doing in that space, and how, you know, maybe in the same breath, how, you know, can entrepreneurs, you know, tap into those localization opportunities?
Yes. So if you look at, in order to understand the whole genesis of localization or import replacement, as other people call it, you have to trace back into the automotive industry, how the Japan built its automotive from a time in the early 1900s where they used to produce cars for US. And then out of that, you know, they started setting their own, like Toyota, Mitsubishi, Nissan, and Suzuki, and so forth. When they wanted to create local capability, they were the first block to adopt supplier development. So their supply development was not for inclusion, it was to build local capacity. And 50 years later, they were the biggest automotive. They were actually exporting cars to the US. It took them 50 years of building strong companies, right? You might have noticed in the past 5 years, they're Chinese cars, right? Chery and Haval. They took the same supply development and built local capacity in order for them to elevate their local production which then creates the jobs that they need. It creates mini industries because their value chain gets expanded.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that because you need to understand that when you say ESD and you say localization, it won't work if you do it for inclusion purposes.
Yeah.
It has to be done for how do you develop local supply chains. Because private sector, you've got procurement teams, and some of them have actually grown to be traders. What does that mean? If I can find it here, I'll find it overseas. And more, you know, for an example, there's a lot of, I'll talk agriculture because it's the area that I've been exposed to. There's a lot of our, you know, herbs that we buy from India. We can grow chilies here.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. But we buy it there. And when you look at the list of government, in some instances they're incongruent with the private sector demand, right? And part of what we need to do is to make sure that we do a PPP on the import replacement so that whatever list that government identifies gets validated into the private sector by people who are actually going to buy it.
Yes.
And say this is the list and settle on it. And then there should be funding, you know, through the IDCs of this world, you know, because they do, you know, industrial development.
Yeah.
You know, where I work for a land bank, we can also provide primary agriculture if it's an import replacement in agriculture because you need your raw material, you need agro-processing, then you need to get it into industries, right? So it's important. It will create jobs. We need to bring back the likes of NAMEC capabilities to support your manufacturing firms, because it's very difficult to set up a manufacturing firm. It's twice as difficult to provide continuous support because it's very expensive, right? To support, you know, a manufacturing firm to do just-in-time, you know, production or Kaizen or, you know, those Japanese philosophies, you know, production systems that they use. And that is where the collaboration between government and private sector can come in. Yeah. It's starting to happen in some pockets where we are seeing that through the incubation, that a perfect, you know, instrument you can use between government and identify, for example, there can be an incubator to support farmers that wants to be in the herb space.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be difficult. As long as there's private sector that are prepared to buy those herbs as part of that ecosystem. Yeah. On this side, government, even where I work at Land Bank, we can provide the funding to the farmers to have the, you know, your primary culture happening, and then the incubator could even have its own processing, so that they do, you know, they can use it until they get to scale, then they can set themselves up. So your IPEP is perfectly correct. The master plans that we have are correct. We just need to make sure that private sector and government set up a joint project so that we can identify which commodities we need to do. Not one do a list and come to the other and say, I've got a list. It's not going to work because the pressures in the private sector might not be aligned to the list that has been developed on the other side.
Yeah, I think there's a huge role that incubation, you know, plays within the space. And I think maybe we can, you know, try and look into part two of this conversation and, you know, touch on some of those issues. I think in wrapping up this conversation, we know that on the 7th of June this year, the Minister of Small Business Development, the Honorable Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, launched the ESD Community of Practice.
Yes.
I would like, perhaps as the co-chair, to just take us, what is the thinking around that community of practice? What are we trying to do there? And how does it, you know, elevate the conversation of ESD, and, you know, how does it accrue to the person on the ground?
Yeah. So remember when we spoke about the players in ESD, we spoke about government, private sector, service provider, entrepreneur. The practitioner is the one who binds all of this together.
Yeah.
Right. The practitioner is either working for government, sometimes they work for SOE, and also they work, or maybe they work for a private sector. They are the ones who must understand the law from the government. They must understand the strategy of the corporate. That includes understanding procurement, identify those opportunities. Once you get that, they need to design the programs. Most of them outsource it. That's where the service providers come in. And the challenge that you normally first get is whether the practitioner is skilled enough to understand the policy of government. Right? In some interviews that I've interviewed people to me as specialists, I'll ask them, what is the preamble of the BEE policy? You could see in their eyes they've never seen it. So there are a lot of practitioners who absolutely have no clue of what the BEE policy, they've never seen it. And yet they're saying they want to drive what's in the policy. You find some who've never been exposed in doing corporate strategy, understanding procurement, you know, and that is why they end up going to a service provider. The weaker the practitioner is, the more money the service provider is going to make. There's a correlation. The stronger the practitioner, the more in line with the service provider is going to do what it needs, and they can control the budget that doesn't go out of whack in terms of spend. So the practitioner needs to have that capabilities of building strategy, understanding procurement, working with procurement on their category strategies, you know, strategic sourcing, import replacement is a specialized area, understanding international trades and how, you know, you set up local capabilities around, you know, knowing that the country might have bilateral with other countries to buy specific products. So as a practitioner, you gotta have a feel of it. You don't have to be an expert. While on this side, you need to manage the service provider, select the right service provider, manage their delivery, make sure that they deliver exactly what is in the brief. On this side, you need to also manage the entrepreneur who is the beneficiary. Over and above that, they also need to manage audit, by the way, when the BE audit is done. So what we've picked up is that a lot of challenges that are happening, it's because as a sector, we like, for an example, you go to a doctor and put reliance on them being a doctor because of the qualification they have. You go to a lawyer knowing they've gone through a process to be an advocate, so you can put reliance on what, not on the person, on what they've been trained on and certified. Similar to a CA. When you see that CA, there's a level of comfort what this person can do. From an ESD, you don't know. It's all system goes, both in terms of the skills. So if you can take 10 ESD practitioners and say, can you all write your qualifications? You'll be shocked. It's a mismatch. So we want to start designing programs. Currently we're busy with myself and my co-chair, Mzwanele Mewan, working with CEDA to create a program for practitioners. Right? That's step one, so that we make sure they're trained on the right things. We're going to elevate those programs that they eventually get to a university level. So where you can actually go and get, whether it's a postgrad diploma in ESD, so that when a company hires you, they can put reliance. When an entrepreneur sees you, they can put in reliance that you are skilled. We are looking also at setting up standards so that you can be a doctor, but you have to operate within a certain level of standards. Ethical behavior, right? There's been ESD practitioners who've been caught on the cookie jar, but they just leave one company and go to the next. We also want to be an area where if companies want to recruit, they can actually they can come to the sector body and get candidates, right? We also want to make sure that practitioners network so that they can share information amongst each other. You know, because you might find a practitioner in a food company A do a project B, which is perfect, and you go to company A, B, and you find that the practitioner is struggling with project B, which is one has managed to get it right and another one hasn't managed it right. We also need to get practitioners to know when it comes to development, there's no competition. Whether you work for a competitor, there's no competition. Because we are all working towards dealing with issues of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So that networking, coming together, sharing best practice, asking each other questions, what about this, becomes critical. And the last one is to make sure that there's a voice in the industry that can talk on behalf of the practitioners. For example, about the credit guarantee that was done during COVID.
Yes.
If the industry was consultant, if we're organized, we would have told them, if you're gonna use traditional banks as your conduits for the credit guarantee, it's not gonna work.
Yeah.
But we don't have a voice. If the B codes gets changed now, the ESD, the codes gets changed, we don't contribute into that. But we become the people who must implement whatever the changes. And some of the changes that have been made are very shocking. You can see these are people that don't do ESD. If you look at some of the architectures of the ESD, Act and the Code of Good Practice. So we also want to do policy, contribution, regulation contribution. Because we work in these corporates and in government, we see what's going on. Our insights are critical to be, pushed into a policy, discussion, and also looking at regulations. So our job is to make sure that we've got a vibrant industry. And the last point about this, we also wanted to make it a career of choice.
Yes.
I get a lot of students who see my career, they have no idea what it is. But when I tell them, they get excited. I've been called by universities to go and speak to their entrepreneurship students. And when I tell them what we do, they get excited. But you find even them, they stumbled into the entrepreneurship course.
Yeah.
So we want those programs for kids to know at high school that you can actually be a practitioner. The nice thing about our industry, you can also convert into an entrepreneur because of the insight that you get and the expertise that you build. So those are the type of things that the community of practice actually want to do, so that going forward we can have a fully fledged industry body like SECA, where we can be able to be there as a home for ESD practitioners. Currently, we've excluded consultants. We've just included only ESD practitioners who are in corporate or in public sector who are responsible for running portfolios. We will onboard the consultant. The problem is that we didn't want them to come and start positioning and do sales. We are going to also on board, because sometimes practitioners do move from being in the implementation part or service provider and move into corporate, and sometimes the move happens the other way. But this is the first phase. Second phase, we are going to open it up to our fellows in the implementation, fund management, and so that it's a home for all. It's just that we wanted to design it without people who've got their interest of getting business in it.
Sounds like you've got your work cut out. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of episode 1 of Big Biz with myself, Billy Bukako. I would like to thank my guest, Mr Litha Kutta, for all the knowledge. I've learned so much, and I wish to immortalize this moment and ask him to please sign my cue card so that anybody who says this moment never took place, I can say I even have his autograph.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much
for the invite, and excited that you really invited me. And your Big Biz is really going to be contributing a lot into the space, because there's a lot of demystification that needs to happen, and I'm grateful for the inputs that I was able to provide.
Thank you so much, Buti, and for being such a wonderful guest. This is a little gift from ourselves to you. Ladies and gentlemen, please go to our social media. Tell us what you think about this first episode. And if you're out there, you're an ESD fund manager, you are someone who is interested in the space, and you're saying this is good work and you would like to see it, our email is on the screen. Please hit us up and let's make sure that we carry on doing great work. My name is Billy Bukako, and this has been Big Biz. Thank you.